Combined, I would say one of the real contributions of this new body of scholarship is that it illustrates the very, very violent way that Kazakhs were treated. I think a lot of older approaches were very rooted in evolutionary theory, and by that I mean the understanding that nomadism was somehow going to inevitably disappear, that this was an inevitable outgrowth of modernization. And one of the things that this scholarship has done is to show that there was nothing natural about what happened to Kazakhs in a very, very kind of violent and brutal way that they were treated. This scholarship has also begun to pinpoint some of the differences and commonalities between famine in Kazakhstan and the famines that happened elsewhere in the Soviet Union. I think there's still a lot more work to be done on that. Okay, so turning to the specific studies themselves, there's Isabel. One of the things I have to say first is that a scholar of the Kazakh famine, it is incredibly linguistically demanding. We are a very international bunch. So it requires a lot of languages. So Isabel Ohion's study was one of the first Western studies based grounded in the archives to look at the famine. Ohion really, in her study, uses the approach of social history to get at the story of the famine. She's interested in the politics of sedentarization as a program of social transformation. Her main focus is not central decision making, and the chronology she uses is 1928 to 1945. So this is an essential difference between some of the studies, is the kind of chronological frameworks that we have chosen. The next one is Nicolo Pianchola's work. I will not go into that too much detail on that, because you can ask him himself. But one of the real contributions that I think he has made is to use the tools of economic history to analyze the story of the famine. He begins his work in the 1890s when the Kazakh steppe was under Russian imperial rule. He looks at the legacies of Russian imperial rule, the economic ties that bound peasants and Kazakh nomads together. He sees the famine as very crucial for the incorporation of Kazakhs into the Soviet state. Process he frames as pt.3of3, and his chronology is really from the 1890s through 1936. So, turning to the next work, this is the work of Robert Kibler, which is just out in German. Kibler takes a very different approach in the way that he analyzes the famine. The major lens that he uses is violence. So he argues that the Bolsheviks really instituted a process of Sovietization through hunger, forcing Kazakhs to become subjects of their rule by provoking a crisis. He really questions the label of modernization to describe the Soviet aims in Kazakhstan. And he finds the famine to be the result of the Soviet regime's high modernist program, while actors on the ground used pre-modern practices to enforce their interests. He spends a lot of time on the local level patterns of violence. He sees violence as an option that was available to everyone, which different actors used to generate their interests. Kibler, like many other scholars, Western scholars working in the famine, argues that Moscow did not plan the crisis, they welcomed it nonetheless, and he argues that it should not be considered a genocide. The next scholar is Matthew Payne, who's a scholar at Emory. I won't say too much about his work because I don't know what direction he's going with it. He has published an article on the Kazakh famine, and from what I understand of his study, the major focus is sedentarization, so that is the lens that he uses. So finally, my own project, I'm really interested it's the outgrowth of my dissertation on the Kazakh famine. I'm really interested in the tension between Soviet nation-making and Soviet modernization in the Republic, and showing how these tensions were then exacerbated by a regional agricultural crisis that the Soviets inherited from Russian imperial rule. One of the differences that I try to flesh out in the book I'm working on is we've talked a lot about the role of the peasantry in Marxist, Leninist theory and so on. Kazakhstan was a place for which the Soviets they had no models. There was no very little way to understand the people or the environment in the frameworks that they brought with them. My book overall will challenge those works that see Soviet nation-making as inherently progressive. I aim to show that it had a very violent and participatory character deeply embedded within it. So I look, for instance, at some of the facets of nation-making that the Soviets tried to make Kazakhs conform to, the idea of a fixed territory, the idea that nations had to be economically productive. They did not see, for various reasons, pastoral nomadism to be economically productive. And I hope to use a range of approaches on the question of the Kazakh famine, including environmental history, social history, and some of the new anthropological literature on the relationship between nomads and the state. Along the way, I also hope to raise broad questions about why we remember or why we forget certain episodes of Stalinist violence. You may get the impression from the different studies that I have shown you that there is a lot of research on the Kazakh famine. In fact, this is a very recent development, and many existing studies of the Soviet, of violence in the Soviet Union or even overviews don't even mention it. So I'm curious as to why that came to be so. I look at along the way, I look at how a variety of factors from Cold War politics to independent Kazakhstan's own nation-building efforts have kept this disaster hidden from view in Kazakhstan and the West. So I'll turn now to some of the future directions for research. So one of the first questions that I wanted to raise about which I would argue that we still don't understand very much. Now that we know more about the Kazakh famine, what does this tell us about famine in Ukraine or in other areas of the Soviet Union? How did Moscow's response to the Kazakh famine, which begins earlier, then affect their response to subsequent famines? So if you look, for instance, at some of the older works like Robert Conquest, he says that that Stalin actually, for Stalin, the example of the Kazakh famine was a useful model. And Tim Snyder in his work also expands this. He says that it was a very useful model for how they would treat Ukrainians. But I think we still need to do more work to establish the connections between these two famines. I would love to have the document that collects it all. I don't, but I think more work needs to be done. The second question I wanted to raise, I think we still need more work on, is the question of how people died in the Kazakh famine. So in the Kazakh case, disease was far more important than in some of the other famines in the Soviet Union. But we don't really understand, what really was the cause of mortality. So that more work needs to be done on that. The third point is that of regional differences. So Kazakhstan itself is the size of continental Europe, but the regional story of the famine is really not well understood. I think we need to do further research in regional archives to illuminate this part of the story. Stephen Wheatcroft, who's now at Nazarbayev University in Astana, is working on a project on this, and I think it could be quite interesting. So the fourth point I wanted to make is the question of the mortality figures. So in Kazakhstan, I would say that the figures have not been subject to as much study as in other parts of the Soviet Union. And in part that is due to simply the challenges of the information that we have. And I'll raise a couple of those. One is that a number of Kazakhs did flee to different parts of the Soviet Union. They also fled to China. And from what I understand from talking to colleagues who work on Xinjiang is that the subject of censuses in that period was also very complicated. So it's very, very difficult to ascertain exactly how many people fled, exactly how many people returned, and that problem is very intertwined with calculating the numbers in the Kazakh famine. And I mean, the other problem is a very basic one. which is in 26. The Soviets did a census of Kazakhstan. They counted some of the nomads in Kazakhstan, but as you can probably gather, the whole project of counting nomads, people who don't stay in one place, who actually move around, is very difficult. So there are specific problems, I think, to try to calculate the death toll in Kazakhstan. Point number 5, I wanted to talk a little bit about. I think we still need more, there's more work to be done on the role of Kazakh actors, how these Kazakhs understood this assault on their own society. So the bulk of the sources for research on the Kazakh famine, the vast majority are in Russian. But there's a small but significant number of sources in Kazakh. So these are things like newspapers, petitions, document collections, and also secondary literature. But one of the challenges in looking at that is, first, this was a society that was largely non-literate at this period. They were nomads. And also the script itself changed very rapidly during this period. So it's changed to the Latinate script in the 20s, but prior to that, many Kazakhs used a modified Arabic script. So, it often, even though the script itself had changed by the late 1920s, you still see, for instance, many Kazakhs writing in the archives, many petitions or using the modified Arabic script. And there's a real problem of sources here because in talking to many local scholars, very few of them know it. I have talked with many of them and they tell me, look, it's like a foreign language for us. Learning this Arabic script. And so there is a whole kind of group of sources here that I think could be really important to understanding some of these questions which are not being used. So the 6th point is, and there are of course many other points we can add to this list, this is just illustrative of some of the things I thought of, is a question of memory. There's a very striking difference, for instance, between the way that the famine has been remembered in Kazakhstan and the way that the famine has been remembered in Ukraine. So we might, raise the question: what accounts for these differences? What are the reasons for the relative kind of silence about the famine in Kazakhstan? And the 7th and last point is the question of the human story. So in Kazakhstan, we really have very few sources that are outside of the state bureaucracy. In Ukraine, for instance, there were foreign journalists reporting on the story, like Garrett Jones. And in Kazakhstan, there are very few memoirs. To my knowledge, there were really no foreign journalists. This was not an area of the Soviet Union that was on the radar screen of most people in the West at that point. There are very few surviving diaries or memoirs from the Kazakh famine. One of the only ones I know of is the diary of Tatyana Nevadovskaya, and she was actually a Russian woman, so it's quite interesting that when many Kazakhs look for poetic accounts of the Kazakh famine, of human suffering, they often turn to this journal, which was written by this woman, and we have very few. There's the Shaykhnyatov account, Silent Steppe, which is a memoir, but other than that, we have very few sources. And very little oral history was done in the case of Kazakhstan. And I myself have tried to do some oral history interviews, but the problem I could say is that it's too late. Many people start to confuse the story. The ones who survive now were very little during the disaster itself. So that's a brief overview of some of the points I thought of, and I look forward to your questions.